Hello. I'm going to front load um, this video with just the advice off the bat. So if you guys are short on time, my main point here, I think the takeaway is I'm going to ask my students to not put in their race in the optional categories. Before, I used to not really care. So I used to think some students just filled it out. Other students didn't. But from here on out, November 15th deadline for a couple niche schools, December 1st, November 30th for UCs, December 1st for scholarship and merit, and mainly like January, the rest of the regulars and beyond. For those applications and henceforth, I'm going to ask my students to not indicate their race. And if you want to understand why, you can stick around, but if that's all you needed, all right. By the way, if you are curious about how it actually even looks on the applications, so it's right here. You could see I made a dummy account. Parents, students, even if you're not a senior, rising junior, you can go online and you can make a dummy account and you can see all this. The question about race, nationality, ethnicity shows up in demographics. It's your identity. And so if you click Asian, it specifies. I've been asked, like, where do Middle Eastern students put in? Because I've had students from Dubai and places like that. So it shows up right there. It's not required. The required questions would have a red asterisk next to it. So you wouldn't be able to submit if you didn't answer this and it had a red asterisk, but it doesn't have one, so it's optional. Why would students want to put down their race? We'll get into that. I think the video will show. And this is how the UCs show it. Just wanted to show you kind of another application, how it looks. So I feel like the UCs is a lot more direct and detailed. And there you go. Okay, let's listen up.
Would get if the student's family had come from someplace else. So you would say to the student, well, we don't need you to contribute to a diversity of views at our school because we already have enough Asians. We have a lot of students whose families came from China or other Asian countries. And the student says, well, you don't have anybody like me. I'm from Afghanistan. What similarity does a family background of a person from Afghanistan have with somebody whose family's background is in, let's say, Japan?
So respectfully, what you're describing is the exact opposite of how our process actually works on an individualized basis. We discussed this on.
So the justice is talking about comparing, let's say, a Chinese student to an Afghanistan student. Maybe I think what he might have been referring to is that here on the Common App, which is for Harvard applications, when you click mark Asian, you see how it gives you all these options. So the question might be, obviously Afghanistan is not the same as Pakistan or Malaysia or anything like that. But the point being, what similarity, if I choose to just check mark Asian and I don't check mark anything else, then why are these so categorized together? What are we gaining out of categorizing Chinese and Pakistani? Interesting question.
On page 11 of our brief, there was a Vietnamese student. The admissions officer testified about a Vietnamese student who immigrated to a remote part of North Carolina and thrived in that setting. And she testified undisputed that was a favorable aspect of her application.
That's an individual aspect of the application and something that has to do with her experience. But
okay, that's really interesting. I'm taking away maybe 2 or 3 points from that. Okay, so number one, they're actively recruiting from rural areas. They have too many students, overrepresentation from urban populations. So for those super try-hard parents and families and students out there, maybe by the time you get into 9th grade, you move to a rural area of your state. That's what they say. They're going to actively recruit there. Second thing I get is Vietnamese. And this is where I might trigger a little bit more of these accusations of racism against me, but I'm going to say it the way I see it. I think that the majority Asians in college admissions is probably Korean, Chinese, Indian, maybe Japanese. So if you're not one of those, so let's say you come from Cambodia or Vietnam or the Philippines or Malaysia or Burma, Myanmar, I forgot which one was which. Sorry about that. But if you are not Chinese, Japanese, Korean, or Indian, the argument is that you have an advantage by check marking this box because you are, relative to the others that I just mentioned, a minority when it comes to competitive school admissions. So I might have to correct my statement. Shoot, I told everyone at the beginning that not to put in your race, but that's not true. Okay, hopefully y'all been listening to this point that it depends on what race. Let's continue. Oh, actually, the third. I said there was a third. So the third is you want to write your essays about it. So I've been talking about how, where, especially with the first of these affirmative action case videos, that it's going to come down to EQ, your teacher recommendations, your essays. Talking about being Vietnamese, growing up in a rural part of America is 100% the essay you should be writing about to give you an advantage when you're looking for these schools that have these types of, I guess, like recruiting desires. Let's continue.
What is the justification for lumping together students whose families came from China with students whose families came from Afghanistan? What do they have in common?
So I agree that would be a strange rule, and that is not the rule that this court has established.
Well, then why do you have them check a box that I'm Asian? What do you learn from the mere checking of the box?
So we think that it depends on the individual circumstances of that person. But
so you don't need the boxes at all.
So I think that is not necessarily true on an individualized basis. So another example. So we, again, as I discussed, we attempt very vigorously to recruit and enroll rural students. And we don't ask them to write their essay about how being from a rural background affects their sense of self and their experiences. But what we say is that person comes with something that we value.
Well, they may choose to write about it, but what's the answer to my question? Why do you have these boxes? Why do you give a student the opportunity to say, this one thing about me, I'm Hispanic, I'm African American, I'm Asian. What does that in itself tell you?
We think that it can, in context, on a individualized basis, perhaps not in every case, but in some cases, give important information about where that person is coming from and what their experiences have been. And really, this goes to the heart of the dispute that we have between the parties. So they say on page 53 of their brief that race says nothing about who you are. And we just don't think that is true when you look at American society as it exists. We think that in the context of everything else that we know about an applicant, it can matter, not always, and there's no automatic plus factor that's given, but it can matter what an applicant's racial background is.
Let me just ask one more related question, and that is, the circumstance, this is a real problem, and I've heard it described to me by people who face it. When can a student honestly claim to fall within one of these groups that is awarded a plus factor? So let's say the student has one grandparent who falls within that class.
This is an excellent question because I get this from some students. The example being, let's say it's a Chinese student, but his grandfather up in Tibet or in Thailand. Can I mention that and mark that as my ethnicity or how I identify? I think it comes down to how you genuinely feel about the influence it had on you. And the thing about that is that admission officers won't be able to ultimately parse that out, right? There's no quantifiable way. So this is an interesting question. If you know that you have a family history that goes into areas that are more advantageous in terms of the admissions criteria, how far back can that lineage go for me to validly claim that in my common application or my UC application? So on the application itself, there's no extra context requirement. It's checkmark what you identify with. And really the question is about enforcement and transparency or regulation, I suppose is another way. Like, how will an admission officer know you're telling the truth? Because maybe I identify as Vietnamese, right? And you could check mark that, and you can drop Chinese. And then you have this particular, at that point, now you have an advantage. Now, granted, they'll probably be able to look at other context things in your applications. They'll look at your essays to see what you write about it. But this is a really interesting question.
Can the student claim to be a member of an underrepresented minority?
Yes, we rely on self-reporting, and we don't give it.
One great-grandparent.
If that person believes that that is the accurate expression of their identity, I don't think there would be any.
One great-great-grandparent. You're going to make me continue to go on.
Right. I think that as we go on, I agree that it would seem less plausible that that person would feel that this is actually capturing my true racial identity. But the same is true for any of the other diversity factors that we.
It's family lore that we have an ancestor who was an American Indian.
So I think in that particular circumstance, it would be not accurate for them to say based on.
I identify as an.
Okay, so in this court, this is pretty interesting. I think this has to do with there's some political kind of innuendos there with Senator Elizabeth Warren and identifying with Native American ancestry. But putting that aside, you do get some things you could take away. So, for example, the Harvard lawyer just mentioned how if your grandparent, let's say you take it back to our example, if your grandparent, let's say your grandfather has a Vietnamese background, like grew up there and had a business and lived there, then you can associate yourself with that. But as you go further on, it becomes less probable. So up to grandparent at the very least, that's what I'm getting. Interesting.
American Indian, because I've always been told that some ancestor back in the old days was an American Indian.
Yeah, so I think in that circumstance, it would be very unlikely that that person was telling the truth. And the same is true for, we rely on self-reporting for all the demographic and other characteristics that we ask for. And there's nothing special about the racial identification on that score, Your Honor.
Okay, so that's basically it. The reason why I'm going to advise students to not put in a race at the end is kind of about gaming or breaking the system. So it's not really advice that I'd want to openly, well, I guess I am because I'm putting it on YouTube, but I think that there's no way that they'll be able to verify what you identify as. It becomes purely subjective. There are ways you can quantify it out, but not to 100%. I'm not asking students to take advantage of this and exploit this in a negative way. But here's my thought. How do colleges create the demographic data of their accepted student body? I think it's mainly self-reported. And the self-reporting element comes in probably through the application. I'm not sure if there's other ways, maybe through financial aid, FAFSA, CSS, I'm not sure. Maybe through your college board when you sign up and register, and then when you send in your SAT scores, maybe. But whatever the case is, if you theoretically went completely silent and never answered a race question for anything academic related, then when they get accepted and let's say go to Harvard, are they going to be counted as one of the Asian students? How would they know? And wouldn't they risk offending you and the way you identify for yourself? And that made me think, wait a second. So is there like an entire population of Asians who opted not to put that in and therefore are not included in the breakdown? I'm sure this could all get broken apart, this thought process, by getting some verifiable data from admissions. But if you don't put in a race, does that give the college more of a reason, especially, well, let me clarify. If you have a minority race or identity, you should put it in because it gives you an advantage. If you don't, and you don't put it in, then wouldn't that be helpful to the colleges? Because then the colleges wouldn't necessarily need to report the fact that they are I'd have to think about this some more before I decide to post more about it. But I hope you see where I'm going with this. I feel like if you don't put in a race, if let's say if you're Korean, Chinese, Indian, and you don't indicate a race, then it might be more advantageous for you, because then the colleges will have less of a deterrence against you to say, oh, we got a lot of Chinese students. This one identifies as Chinese. If we accept them, it's going to come into the demographic. Yeah, just some thoughts. I hope that this was helpful. I'm going to continue to try to make this useful. I'm gathering a lot of information from this of how I can advise and coach my students in the future. But yeah, thank you for joining in. Talk to you guys soon.